Welcome to the Heal from Your Narcissist podcast, your go-to guide for everything you need to know about narcissistic personality disorder and narcissistic abuse. Get ready to dive into understanding what drives narcissistic behavior and to learn clinically proven techniques for healing from the effects of narcissistic abuse with your host, best-selling author, and registered psychotherapist, Heather Kent.
Welcome back to the Heal from Your Narcissist podcast. I am so excited to have you here because today we are going to be continuing our journey of healing from our narcissistic past relationships. So in the last episode, we focused on understanding what narcissistic personality disorder looks like and the specific traits to look out for in people that you encounter or new people who come into your life in the future. So today we're going to talk about the signs of narcissistic abuse. And so how do we know that we have survived or we've gone through narcissistic abuse? How do we know what are the telltale signs? And so to highlight this, I first want to talk about the narcissistic cycle of abuse. Okay, so the narcissistic cycle of abuse is very specific to narcissistic personality disorder. A typical cycle of abuse will, as most people are familiar with, there's a honeymoon phase, and then there's an escalation phase, and then there's the blow up and abuse phase. And then the abuser will be conciliatory and apologize, promising to be different, promising for things to be better. And then they go back into the honeymoon phase and the whole thing repeats again. Now, the narcissistic cycle of abuse follows a similar pattern, but there are a few key differences. And so, everyone who has been in a romantic relationship can recall those initial feelings of joy and excitement, a bit of euphoria, when you start dating someone new, when you meet someone new, there's electricity, there's all kinds of fun feelings happening. And, it's pretty common to feel this electricity and this excitement. And this is usually referred to as what we call the honeymoon stage. And we call it that for a reason. But in the narcissistic abuse cycle, we call this honeymoon stage the idealization or the love bombing stage. And the reason why it's given a different name is because this phase is next level. It goes above and beyond, the regular honeymoon stage that we all have experienced. A narcissist will engage in massive amounts of what we would call love bombing, where they idealize the person, they put the person up on a pedestal, they really rush intimacy, they are so intense, it's all encompassing, it's all consuming. They are dying to just spend all their time with you. And they, compare you favorably to previous partners, and they say that you're amazing. You've saved them. They can't wait to spend the rest of their lives with you. They start future faking and planning these wonderful futuristic ideas with you. Lots of grand gestures, gift giving, over the top, showing up to your house with bouquets of flowers unexpectedly, driving for 3 hours to see you at work, mirroring things that you do and say to convey this feeling of sameness and that you're so understood and that you have this strong bond and connection because you're so similar. Lots of oversharing of details early on in the relationship of a, traumatic past or traumatic childhood or, quote unquote, crazy ex-partners. There's a little bit of testing and crossing your boundaries very early on and trying to draw you in. to feel like you have this sense of connection and obligation to the narcissist in a very, very early stage. Lots of flattery, like I said, lots of excessive attention, very intense sexual seduction and sexual connection. And so this is just very over the top. And the goal is for the narcissist to cultivate this sense of trust and commitment from us very early on. And they engage in our empathy to kind of accelerate this bonding process, this feeling of loyalty, this sense of attachment, feigning love while planting these seeds of very subtle seeds of self-doubt in order to foster this emotional dependency and to secure power and control in the relationship very early on. And they invest in us, in the victim, to instill this sense of gratitude and obligation, and like that we owe them something because they're so generous, they're so kind, they're so involved, they're so helpful. And so we feel incredibly special. Like it is unlike any other relationship you have ever had. It feels intense, but it feels amazing. You feel those intense feelings of love. You feel trust. You feel that sexual desire. We, experience these really heightened levels of serotonin release and dopamine release, all the happy hormones. We feel amazing. We feel very attached to them. And we feel, like I said, that sense of owing them because they've invested so much time and energy and money into us. And so when they start to do things that are questionable, that we would normally raise an eyebrow at, we are very quick to give them the benefit of the doubt. And we can wrap it up in this context of compassion and, oh, they've been through a lot. Because remember, they've shared their past quote unquote trauma stories with you. And so we feel compassion towards them, and we feel, this tenderness for them. And, even though they start to ignore our personal boundaries, and maybe we start modifying our behavior to go along with what the narcissist wants. But all of this is okay because this is just incredible. It's amazing. And so that is what the love bombing or idealizing phase feels like. And the narcissist, is just so good in this phase. And they feel that they found perfection. They put you up on this pedestal. And so they pour all of their affections into the new partner. And so this is just amazing. But it can also feel really overwhelming. And, in the regular cycle of relationships, the honeymoon stage does eventually wear off and things start to kind of settle down into a more predictable and manageable routine. And of course, you still love them dearly. You are super connected to them. But that initial euphoria, eventually wears off. And this is when most couples start to grow closer in many ways and learn how to work together as partners. However, in the narcissistic abuse cycle, this phase of the relationship looks very different. And this is the phase that we call the devaluation phase, or the devaluing phase. And so, as you may guess, the narcissist starts to devalue their partner instead of growing closer. And so this is when they realize that their partner is actually not perfect, because you're human. After all, nobody is perfect. And so once the shine wears off, well, then they no longer have any value. And remember, the value of a person for a narcissist is only to fuel their own self-image and importance, and to be a element of narcissistic supply. What is narcissistic supply? It is that constant need of admiration, adoration, validation, etc. They constantly need to be validated externally by other people because of their intense inner insecurities. And so you serve as a source of narcissistic supply. And when they realize that you are not perfect, your supply isn't quite as good as it used to be. And so they start to devalue you. And so this may show up, in many different ways, but usually it gets provoked by a narcissistic wound that happens when you respond to an inappropriate or abusive thing that they did, or they might feel threatened and defensive, betrayed, victimized. All of these things happen very, very easily whenever there's, some kind of poke to a narcissistic injury. And so what they'll start to do is try to regain power and control over you. They will triangulate, they'll use comparisons to other people, and talk about what other people do and say, and how other people agree with them about you being the problem. They might even just blatantly flirt with other people in front of you or be unfaithful to you. They will provoke any kind of insecurity within us, the victim, and to make us feel replaceable. And so they attempt to destabilize by causing us to doubt the reality that we live in and question our sanity. And this is where gaslighting behaviors come into play. And so they can become very easily bored and resentful, like I said, once they realize that you're not perfect. And they look for new sources of validation and stimulation, i.e., new sources of supply from other people. So they could seek out new relationships. That reflection of perfection is constantly what they're looking for because that's what they need to see within themselves. And so they begin to love bomb or idealize someone new. And so they also use our increasing emotional distress to attract sympathy from other people. Look what I have to deal with. Look at how, messed up she is. And oh my goodness, and they present as the doting, caring, sympathetic partner to the crazy, over emotional basket case, that victim. And so in this devaluation stage, the narcissist will begin to make these subtle suggestions of how we can change or how we could improve under the guise of being concerned or caring for them or wanting to help them. They deliver lots of criticism, subtle or not so subtle degradation, insults, maybe some name calling. Again, in this case, they might do that under the guise of humor. And when you feel hurt by that and express that hurt, they will make fun of you and gaslight you and saying that you're too sensitive and it was just a joke and you need to relax. They may start to overtly isolate you and restrict or control your resources or your activities or who you spend time with. They will engage in emotional withdrawal and not be interested in talking to you, not really feel excited about spending time with you, perhaps giving you the silent treatment. And we call this stonewalling. They may nitpick. They are possibly using intimidation and threats. They are definitely using gaslighting, and they are violating our boundaries. And communication breaks down. And, again, back to triangulation and trying to confuse us. And so the impact on us, the survivors of abuse, is that, of course, we are devalued. We feel punished for inconveniencing our partner by trying to set boundaries or trying to stand up for ourselves. We call out unacceptable behavior and we get punished for it. Or we might get punished for not being complacent, not just going along, or not, being obedient with whatever it is that they've asked you to do. So we experience decreased levels of those very happy hormones. And we experience symptoms of depression, anxiety, some fear, lots of self-doubt, unending confusion, maybe some memory problems, sleep disturbance. We experience what we call cognitive dissonance, where it feels very confusing because this person loves us, right? And that connection, remember, it was so amazing. And they understand us more than anyone else in the world. And this must be all wrong. They can't be harming me. I must be misunderstanding, right? And so there's this real confusion about what's going on. And disconnection from our inner intuition, that gut feeling that says, run, run. We ignore that because, again, we're so committed, and we remember that amazing connection. And that's what we grasp onto. It's what I clung desperately to whenever things got really ugly. And so we really just lose a connection with our intuition. And we start to placate. We might feel like we're walking on eggshells. Oh my gosh. I remember I used to pull into the driveway after work, and I would stay at work longer than I needed to so that I wouldn't be home. And I would steel myself for a moment in the car before I got out to go into the house, because I never knew what I was going to be walking into. It's like a little bit of like emotional Russian roulette. Like it could change on a dime and you have no idea what it's going to be. And so this walking on eggshells feeling is very common. And it was certainly paramount for me. And a lot of going along to get along, because we want to avoid conflict. We want to avoid any kind of like poking the bear. And so we blame ourselves for problems in the relationship. What can I do? How could I get this wrong? What can I do better? What do I need to do differently? How do I need to change? And we try to regain our partner's attention. And, we try to get their love back. When we are, in that triangulation situation, we become hypervigilant to the narcissist's very oscillating moves. Like I said, emotional Russian roulette. What are you going to get at any moment? We really don't know. But we try to predict their behavior and their needs so that we can mitigate or minimize any kind of conflict or escalation. We experience lots of fear, sense of obligation and guilt. Fear, obligation, and guilt. We call this the fog of narcissistic abuse. And we begin to deny, again, like that intuition, and we cling to this hope that things are going to get back to the way they were in the beginning. And so this is where the real kind of confusion sets in. And so this phase of the relationship has nothing to do with increasing closeness, and everything to do with, like we said, devaluing and belittling the victim. And so the narcissist focuses only on putting us down, holding back intimacy or holding back affection. And when we push back, then we might get a brief breadcrumb of attention and love, just enough to keep us on the hook. But they also could turn things around and blame you, perceive themselves as the victim, which allows us to be further devalued. And so when we go to, back to that sort of normal cycle of relationship evolution over time, typically successful couples will reach a point where they not only get along, but they thrive with each other. And you might see this in other couples. You may have experienced it yourself in the past, or maybe you're experiencing it now with someone new, which is great. But partners can, complete each other's sentences. They know what the other person is thinking, and they just seem to really click, and they flow very easily. And of course, everybody has disagreements, everybody has conflict, but they're able to communicate and resolve the differences or resolve the misunderstandings. Now, a narcissist, on the other hand, begins to reject their partner. And this brings us to the third phase, the discard phase, which we call it, in favor of a new relationship that fulfills their needs. Because remember, they have a constant need of new supply. So I want you to think of it as a gas tank of a car that has a hole in it. And no matter how much you fill the tank with gas, it's constantly leaking. Like it's never full and it's never enough. And so one person can never provide enough supply to sustain the needs of the narcissist. And so they constantly are looking for new supply. Now, not to say that they're not going to come back to you for supply a little bit later, because they will, but they can't just get what they need from one source of supply. They need multiple sources at multiple times. And so their needs are not for love or belonging or caring, which is what most couples look for. In fact, that's kind of the bedrock of long-lasting relationships. What narcissists desperately seek are relationships to fuel their ego, their sense of importance, fuel their supply, and validate their existence. And so they're going to reject and discard whoever doesn't fill that need at any given point. And so the discard phase is really, where the abuse becomes extremely intense. And this is where the abuser, the narcissist, will show up being really cruel, showing lots of contempt. We talk about the 4 courses of the apocalypse and things that you can't come back from. Contempt is on that list. And, there might be some coercive force. There could be narcissistic rage. And narcissistic rage could be overt, like loud and aggressive, or it could be silent. It could be silent treatment. They commit even more intense and escalated acts of verbal, emotional, financial, sexual, or possibly physical violence, physical abuse. They commit significant betrayals of your trust. And of course, because the narcissist that is never to blame, is never at fault, they make excuses, they will gaslight, and they will minimize their abuse and their betrayals to you. They invalidate our emotional response and blame us for causing the abuse and being the source of the problem. And then, of course, we get discarded, sometimes temporarily, possibly permanently. And so the agenda of the narcissist in this discard phase is to defensively act against any pain that they are feeling from this narcissistic injury. And so what they're actually doing is projecting their own shame, their own insecurity, and their own self-loathing onto you, onto us, onto the victim. And they escalate their abusive behaviors, and they feel repelled by our emotional response to the abuse, focusing instead on love bombing new people, getting, feeling re-energized from this new source of supply. They feel empowered, they feel entitled, they feel in control, and they use our emotional response to the abuse that we've sustained to prove to others that we are crazy, or we're sick, or we're unwell. And they use that to justify all of their abuse, betrayal, and discarding behavior. And they look for sympathy from others, of course, because they are constantly the victim. They are never in the wrong. And they regain power and control over the victim and the narrative of the relationship. And so what is the impact on us, the survivor? So we, again, are punished for responding to abusive behaviors. We try to calm and reason with them. We apologize for our emotional responses. How dare we have an emotion? And we assume and we take on that blame and responsibility. And I can tell you, this was paramount for me. I firmly believed by the end of the relationship that everything under the sun was my fault somehow, and that I was responsible for fixing it. And we try to fix the relationship, and we try to prove, our sanity to our narcissistic partner and to other people. And we become very emotionally distressed, and we might present as being unhinged. And we start to anticipate the abuse and modify our behavior, again, in order to avoid further conflict. We placate the narcissist to try to get back to that. Again, we're still desperately clinging onto that idealization, love bombing phase. And we either get discarded or we leave the relationship, or when we try to leave, we get sucked into what the kind of fourth bridging stage of abuse is, which is called hoovering. And hoovering is basically the narcissist suddenly paying attention to us again when they sense that we are starting to distance ourselves and to check out after they've discarded us. They hoover us back into the relationship by using the love bombing tactics from the beginning. And we are so relieved to be experiencing that again that we can very easily get sucked back in. And this is, this happens for a myriad of complex and very legitimate reasons until finally leaving permanently feels necessary and it feels possible. Because a lot of the time I know I felt that it didn't feel possible. And so this is the, entirety of the narcissistic cycle of abuse. And it is extremely damaging. And leaving the relationship, of course, is the only way to heal and to recover. And it can lead to a myriad of psychological and physical health problems. So that is the narcissistic cycle of abuse. And so to kind of recap, okay, what are the signs of all of this? Number one, gaslighting. What is gaslighting? So gaslighting is actually a term that comes from, I think it was first a play in the 1920s or 30s, and then it was made into a film in the 1940s called Gaslight. And in this film, the husband and wife who live together, the husband attempts to make the wife think that she's going crazy by, and so this is a period film, of course, set in a time prior to electricity. And so the husband would do things around the house and change things very subtly, like dimming the lights that were gas lights at that time, like with kerosene or whatever. And so he would dim the lights around the house, and his wife would notice, say something like, "Oh my gosh, like the lights are dimmed, like what happened?" And he would say, "What are you talking about? The lights are fine. You must be unwell." Right? And he continued to move things and do these subtle little things to make her think that she was going crazy. And so this is where the term gaslighting comes from. And so obviously gaslighting is not dimming the lights and calling people crazy, but it shows up in many different ways. So gaslighting can sound like, "That never happened. I never said that. You're misremembering. You must have had too much to drink. You are crazy." My personal favorite as a woman, "You're PMSing. You're too sensitive. You need to relax." Or, "I only said or did that because you did this. I never would have had to do that if you hadn't have done this first." Or just a blatant, "That never happened." And so it really causes you to question, okay, wait, did I misremember? Am I overreacting? Maybe it didn't happen. Did maybe, was I dreaming? Did he not say that? Or she not say that? And so it's really, it causes you to question your reality all the time. And so gaslighting is a major sign and very common tactic that's used by narcissists. Grandiosity, whether it's secret, kind of like a covert grandiosity or an overt one. And of course, lack of accountability. unable to take responsibility for their actions, blaming others, denial, deflecting, and never ever accepting responsibility. Bullying and intimidation tactics to get other people to do what they want, mocking and verbally abusive behaviors under the guise sometimes of, I was just joking. And then, of course, the narcissistic cycle of abuse. So those are the big hallmark telltale signs of what narcissistic abuse looks like. Now, there are many common misconceptions of narcissistic abuse that I have come across in my practice and in my work with clients. And they may sound something like this. He hasn't ever hit me, so it can't be abuse. My situation isn't that bad. Now, this one makes my brain melt a little bit because our society has been so brainwashed into believing that a person cannot experience domestic violence or abuse unless there is physical harm done, unless there are cuts and bruises and broken bones. So this is so highly inaccurate. I need to debunk this right now. You do not need to have visible bruises or scars to be suffering from the effects of abuse. And actually, in the province of Ontario, where I live in Canada, this year, the court system has actually finally included emotional abuse as domestic violence in separation and divorce and like family law proceedings. And so this is a huge step forward, but it's taken until 2021 for that to happen. But I need to be very clear that abuse happens long before there are any physical violence situations. Okay, another misconception. He seems to feel bad and he apologizes sometimes after he's treated me poorly. So he must not be a narcissist. Now, correction, he understands what is required of him in order to keep you around. So he's not stupid. He watches TV and he understands social norms. And so he knows what needs to be said in order to placate you, to forgive him, and to continue on. He's just tired or cranky or stressed or insert some other emotion. He doesn't really mean it when he treats me badly. I'm just going to let that hang for a second. Now, there is no excuse for abusive behavior, period. I need to be very clear about that too. And then finally, I could never leave because there's no way I could support myself, or there's no way I could do it on my own. There's no way I can't live alone. What will people think if I have a failed relationship? And so we have been sitting around waiting and hoping for things to get better. And we've realized, of course, that they won't. And most narcissists cannot admit that they need to change or that they are part of the problem, which is why their behavior never gets better. And so we have so many options now as women, especially if we, are high level, we're successful, we have careers, we have things together in our professional lives. And we can live a life that is free from this type of paralyzing fear. And we can feel safe and confident in our personal relationships again. And there's a way for us to heal from all that you've been through. Most importantly, it's so important for you to know that you are absolutely not alone in this. There are so many people who are going through this with you right now as well. And, I am an example of one of those people. So I want to go back to your questions of why did this happen? How could I end up in this situation? Why did I stay so long? Why did I go back? And these are questions that we torture ourselves with over and over and over again. And the answer to this is because we are trauma bonded to our abuser. So the trauma bond is very similar to Stockholm syndrome. So if you have ever heard of Stockholm syndrome, you are aware that this is a situation where people who are held captive, they're kidnapped or whatever, and they're held captive, they over time eventually develop caring and trusting feelings or even feelings of affection for their captors, for the people who are imprisoning them. And so this is actually a type of survival strategy that is very, very well known, of course, in terrorist situations and certainly in acts of war situations. And it can also occur in an intimate relationship. And so, except in an intimate relationship, we don't call it Stockholm syndrome, we call it trauma bonding. And it absolutely shows up when we are in a relationship with a narcissist. And so within a trauma bond, the narcissist partner who has developed codependency because the narcissist is also highly codependent, we, of course, first feel very loved and cared for as a result of the love bombing phase. But this, starts to erode over time. And then we have the emotional, mental, and sometimes physical abuse that takes over very subtly. And, we can see the change, but we don't understand why it's happening. And so we believe that we just need to understand what it is that we're doing wrong in order to get back to that loving part of the relationship. And if we do manage to kind of break free from the cycle, all the narcissist has to do is to go back to that love bombing idealization phase in order to hoover us back in. And so this means that we will stay in the relationship when the abuse escalates because we also feel this intense sense of loyalty and love and connection to our partner. And so it is extremely, extremely difficult to leave and to break the trauma bond. It's very, very challenging. And it's challenging for any survivor of abuse, anyone in an abusive relationship to break from the cycle and to get out. And so remember, trauma bonding happens because our narcissistic partner, an abuser, provides us with these intermittent, breadcrumbs of the idealization phase. So we get intermittent rewards and punishments. So this is a psychological conditioning that develops, and we become kind of ensnared into this situation, constantly hopeful that the next reward is coming and our next, idealization stage is going to come back and we're going to get a reprieve from the suffering. And so we develop this very powerful emotional bond, and this bond is very resistant to change. And so trauma bonding involves, again, this narcissistic cycle of abuse. And we do get back to that period of peace and love and wonderful feelings before tensions start to rebuild again. And we go back through the cycle one more time. And so we will do our best to not get our partners angry, and we will do everything that's expected. We want them to remember, how loving we are, go back to that early phase of time. And we really desperately hope for that return of that behavior. And we think, okay, we just need to work out what we're doing wrong. And then once we figure that out, then everything will go back to the way it was. Everything will go back to being amazing and fantastic and wonderful. And so this is just, it's so, so difficult. And women especially tend to hold on to these toxic relationships and are more vulnerable to trauma bonding for a variety of reasons. And so we also, if we had, traumatic pasts or have been exposed to abuse in our childhoods, we're more vulnerable to trauma bonding, because it was something that kind of seemed and presented as normal to us in our lives. And so this is something to take into account as well. And so we also tend to blame ourselves, of course, for our partner's abusive behavior. We will end up agreeing with them. And I remember I did this one time where I got abandoned in a snowstorm downtown by myself with no coat and no money and no way to get home, because I had apparently embarrassed him because I was upset that my coat got lost. So he left me in a snowstorm, took a taxi, and went home. And I was stranded 35-minute drive away from my house. And I finally managed to figure out a way to get home and borrow money from strangers. And when I got home, I was chastised for how I had embarrassed him. And I apologized to him. And so this is something that absolutely happens. And so I need you to understand that this all contributes to the trauma bond. And so, we are looking for that love and recognition and approval from our partner. And this is intensifying the strength of that trauma bond. And so this is what we're dealing with after we leave, or even, but this is why it's so hard to leave. This is why maybe we went back. In my case, I did go back. I had ended the relationship completely. And 6 months later, I got sucked back in. And so the reason is because of this trauma bond. And there is nothing that you could do to prevent it from happening, because this type of abuse is very slow, it's very insidious, and it is very hard to notice, while it's happening, because it is very, very gradual. And so I'm an East Coast gal, so we're going to talk about cooking lobster as a bit of an example. So just bear with me. So I want you to think of boiling a lobster, and that's how you cook lobster. So there are 2 ways that we can boil a lobster, and we can cook a lobster. We can put one lobster, we can put the pot on the stove, and we can turn on the heat, and we can wait until the water boils, and then we throw the lobster in. Remember, we have to cook them live. Do you think that the lobster understands that something terrible is happening immediately as soon as they feel that hot boiling water? Of course they do. But unfortunately, there's nothing they can do about it. But there's an understanding that, oh no, this is bad. Now, on the other side of the stove, we have a pot of cold water, and we put the live lobster in the cold water. And then we turn on the burner. And it takes a little while, of course, for the water to heat up. But the temperature change, is gradual, it's slow. And so the lobster, doesn't really notice right away that there's anything dangerous happening. That he's just chilling out, everything's cool. And then maybe it starts to feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it's probably fine. And then all of a sudden, the water's really hot. And then the lobster literally is in hot water and knows that something bad is happening. But by that point, they're already in it, and he can't escape from it. So being in an abusive relationship with a narcissist is very much like being that lobster in the cold water. The reason why you didn't notice is because it wasn't like that in the beginning. I often say to my clients, now, if you went on your first date with your partner and he treated you the way that he did at the end of the relationship on date number 1, would you be booking date number 2? And they always laugh at me. They're like, no, of course not. I would run. I'm like, exactly. And so it's really important that we engage in some self-compassion here, because there is absolutely nothing wrong with you, and you aren't to blame. You aren't at fault because you've ended up in this situation. They are so clever and so excellent at a subtle manipulation. And these things happen slowly over time. And so we end up like that lobster in the cold water where we don't even realize what's happening until, we're deep into it. So if any of this is resonating with you, and I hope that you're finding this helpful, I would love to hear more about your story. And so if you'd like to connect with me, head on over to my website at heatherjkent.com and click on the link at the top of the page to book a free consultation with me, because I would love to hear your story and to share more with you and to do whatever I can to help you on your journey. Thank you so much for being with me today, and I look forward to being with you next time.
This has been another episode of Heal from Your Narcissist, where we help survivors of narcissistic abuse make sense of their experience and share clinical tools for healing. If you like today's show, be sure to share with a friend and leave a review on whichever platform you are listening from. And don't forget to connect with Heather directly at www.heatherjkent.com, where you can send her a message, follow her on social media, or book a one-on-one call to continue on your healing journey.